All right, so we've got our tulip project here, pretty tooled up and filed down pretty nice. We run our hands over everything. It flows pretty smooth, looks pretty nice. We do see file marks in here, and that's obviously very common because we filed it, but it's pretty good. We're going to talk a lot today about sandpaper and how the sandpaper works and tips and tricks and techniques and all that about it. But we're going to kind of show you guys what's what. So I have three different type of grits right here. Over here we have 120 grit. Over here we have 150 grit, and then this little piece right here is 220 grit. And we can tell because sometimes on the back on our pieces of sandpaper it'll say 120. Now this one over here doesn't say 120, but it came out of the same sheet when I cut it. So a lot of times, matter of fact, look at that, it's sitting right next to it. It's the exact piece that came out of it. Got lucky. So this one doesn't say 120, but in my desk drawer over there I have it in my 120 pile. And if you guys were at home and you had this stuff, you'd separate it, in a bin or something like that. You put a little brick on it, you write 120, 150, 220. That way you can distinguish it from one another. So we take a look at the back of this. We have 120. This one here says 150. I know this is 220. And the 220 grit piece that we're going to use is real small. We don't need much of it. But let's go over what all this means. Do you guys know what the 120 grit means and the 150 grit? Do you know what that means? What do those numbers mean?
It's like the stiffness.
Okay, so the abrasiveness, I think is the word you were looking for. It does have something to do with that. But what does that number mean? What do you think? Want to take a guess? No clue.
How big the grit is?
Very close. So this 120 means that in every inch by inch, or what would be called a square inch, there is 120 pieces of abrasive grit, 120 pieces of sand, since it's called sandpaper. All right, it's probably not really sand, but we're going to call it sand for the sake of this conversation. There's different types. There's aluminum oxide. There's a whole bunch of different types of grits, but we're going to call it sand for the sake of this. So in an inch by an inch square, we have 120 pieces of sand. So this one here, we have 150 pieces of sand, and in this piece here, we have 220 pieces of sand. So in order to fit more pieces of sand in the same area, what has to happen to those pieces of sand?
It gets small.
They do have to get smaller. And the smaller they go, the smoother our project's going to go. Did our file scratch our project up? Did it put marks in our project? Sure. But did it smooth it out? Sure did. So when we work on a project, every step of the way when we tool it or do a process to it, we start rough and we get to a smooth final project. When we cut these out with the saw, did it look like the general shape of the project? It did. Was it a pretty rough looking shape? Sure was. But that enabled us to go ahead and then start filing it. Now, does it look even more like the shape of the project right now? Yeah, it looks really like it. But is it still pretty rough on the outside?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very rough. So the saw was rough, but the file was a little less rough. And as we work our way down, it's going to get a little bit less rough and a little bit less rough and a little bit less rough. All right, so every step of the way, we're still scratching our project, marking up our project. It's just a matter of how we're going to actually see it. So if we take a look right here, we have 120 grit piece of sandpaper. So I have a piece over here. I'm just going to fold this up. And when I want to sand this, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at my project. And which way is my grain moving? Which way is it facing? Yeah, it's going this way, right? So would I want to sand with or against my grain?
With.
Yeah. So if I scratch it, my scratches are going with the grain on my project. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to start sanding this down real nice. And we can tell that it's starting to turn bright white. It's starting to lighten up a lot. Do you guys know why it's starting to lighten up? Okay, it's starting to remove the outside.
It's like removes the outer layer. It's like.
Well, what happens is when the wood sits in here in the room, or if it sat outside, it would start to oxidize, and it starts to darken. The UV rays is what does it. The sun's light, the lights, these fluorescent lights, they all darken it, some just as fast than the others. Now, sometimes we really like that. Like with a nice piece of black cherry, if we were to set it in the sun, it starts to antique. It turns really dark red, and it's called antiquing it. It looks super sharp. This particular project right here, it really doesn't matter to us too much. We are going to paint this, but what we would want to do is, let's say this was a shelf that we're going to stain, we'd want to sand it all the way down nice and uniform. That way when we stain it, the color's all uniform, and that way when it reoxidizes and ages again, it'll do it at the same rate. So it'll look nice. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by using our 120 grit. Now 120 grit is considered a finishing grit sandpaper. We could start with 100, we could start with 80. For these particular pieces of wood right here, and for most of the stuff that we do, we're going to start off with 120 grit, and we're going to spend 70% of our time with 120 grit. We're going to spend 20% of our time with 150 grit, and then we're going to spend the last 10% of our time with a 220. Think of it like this. The 120 gets out our file marks, okay? And those marks are sometimes decently deep. The 150 just removes our 120 marks. And what do you think the 220 is going to do? Yeah, it gets rid of the 150 marks. So, if I was to look at this thing, all right, really close, I would see that I have scratches in here. And feel that real quick. How's that feel? That pretty smooth? It is smooth. And all right, this is our first grit. So we're going to take this, we're going to go over the whole thing. All right, we have to sand this as well, right here with our grain. We're going to sand this the whole way, and after we get it good with our 120 grit, when we look at it, there's no marks, there's no pencil lines, it's good, it feels nice, then we'll move to our other stuff. Now, is this a nice crisp corner right now?
Yes.
It is, and we wanted that when we were filing it down. It kept everything nice and square and uniform. Now what we're going to do is on these outside edges, as we start to sand these, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start to round them over as well. All right, and that's going to add a little bit of depth to our project. It's going to feel nice. It's going to look real nice. See how I did that? How's that look? That looks pretty good, doesn't it? We'll do the inside. So we're going to spend a decent amount of time sanding these up. Do you think it's super important to be all the way filed before you sand? Absolutely. All right. It's not even a bad idea if you take a look at your projects. Let me see if I put this in here. Can you see this? Is this in frame right here? Okay. Sometimes, since you guys are learning how to file, sometimes you guys just go like this. And look at these marks that it puts in. All right. That's actually not filing. A file has to work by being pushed straight. Remember? So sometimes what you might want to do is, if you have some of those really odd marks, is grab your file, and I'm not pressing hard, push it and work it down your project as you go. That way you can come right back and start your nice sand job. Now, would I be wasting time to go and put some 150 on this right now and then come back with 120? Yeah, it's like taking a step in the wrong direction. How much percent of our time do you think we're supposed to spend with this 120 grit? 70%. So is this doing most of our work, our finished work? Absolutely. Do the same thing on all these pieces, all right? You gotta sand all these up. I know we went over this in some of them. All these here, they're all good, but they're still rough. They're just rough filed. So all of these three pieces need to be all the way sanded. Once they're all the way sanded, we can paint this. We can drill our hole down through the center of this, paint this. This piece over here we can stain up or oil depending on what piece we have. All right, so that's sanding in a nutshell. That's what I wanted to show you guys. There's not too much to it. It does take time, however. It's usually most people's least favorite thing to do, but it kind of makes or breaks the project, all right? It's gonna allow you to have a good finished job. A good finished job starts with a really nice sanding job. Does that make sense to you guys? Ready to get her done? All right.